The story of the American Revolution is one of defiance, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. It was not just a war fought on battlefields, but a struggle of ideals, where the yearning for liberty clashed with the unyielding authority of the British Empire. The American colonies, scattered along the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, found themselves at the center of a revolutionary tide that would forever change the course of history. This is the story of how 13 colonies, once subjects of a distant king, forged a new identity, founded a nation, and set the stage for the future of democracy itself. The seeds of rebellion. In the 1760s, the American colonies were still part of the British Empire. They were economically prosperous and socially diverse, yet they were governed from across the ocean. The colonists had enjoyed a significant degree of self-rule in their local affairs, but the British government, facing mounting debts from wars and the need to maintain an empire, began to impose stricter controls and taxes on the colonies. The first significant crack in the relationship came with the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed the American colonies on all printed materials, including newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. The reaction in the colonies was swift and furious. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed across the land. Colonists felt that they had no say in the decisions being made about them. Though the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766 due to widespread protests, the tension between Britain and the colonies was far from over. In the years that followed, Britain continued to impose new taxes and laws, such as the Townshend Acts 1767, which placed duties on imported goods like paper, glass, and tea. In retaliation, the colonists began to boycott British goods and to form groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams, to organize resistance. Tensions escalated further with the Boston Massacre of 1770, where British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists, killing 5. But it was the Tea Act of 1773, designed to help the struggling British East India Company by giving it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, that pushed the situation to the brink. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. This act of defiance infuriated the British government, which responded by passing the Intolerable Acts, a series of punitive laws designed to punish Massachusetts and reassert British control. Colonies, however, were not intimidated. Instead, they began to unite in their opposition to Britain. The First Continental Congress convened in 1774, with delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies meeting in Philadelphia to coordinate a response to the Intolerable Acts. They sent a petition to King George, I asking for a repeal of the oppressive measures, but their appeals were ignored. Britain's response only hardened the resolve of the colonies. The shot heard the world. By the spring of 1775, the conflict had escalated beyond words and protests. Tensions were boiling over, especially in Massachusetts, where British troops were stationed to quell unrest. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers marched to Lexington and Concord to seize a stockpile of weapons held by the colonists. But when they arrived in Lexington, they encountered armed colonial militia. At Lexington Green, a shot was fired. It is unknown who fired first, but it marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The British soldiers moved on to Concord, but the colonial militias had already moved their weapons, and fierce fighting erupted. The British were forced to retreat, and along the way, They were harassed by colonial militia. The battles of Lexington and Concord are often remembered as the shot heard round the world, symbolizing the start of a conflict that would change the world. In the aftermath of the battles, the colonies began to organize themselves into a war effort. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, with the colonies now on the brink of full-scale rebellion. It was during this Congress that the colonies made a fateful decision to form a Continental Army, with George Washington chosen as its commander-in-chief. Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was known for his leadership and unyielding determination. The Declaration of Independence. The early years of the war were marked by setbacks and difficulties for the Continental Army. In 1776, Washington and his troops suffered defeats in New York and were forced to retreat across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. But the spirit of revolution was not easily extinguished. In December of 1776, Washington achieved a surprising victory at the Battle of Trenton, crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night to attack a garrison of Hessian soldiers. Despite these small victories, the war was far from over. In 1776, the colonists were still not united in their desire for complete independence from Britain. Many still hoped for reconciliation with the Crown, while others feared the chaos that might come from declaring independence. But a shift in public opinion was underway. The turning point came with the publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, in January 1776. Paine's eloquent arguments for independence resonated with many colonists, and the pamphlet helped to galvanize support for a break from Britain. Paine's words inspired a growing number of leaders in the colonies to consider the possibility of independence. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in the Continental Congress calling for independence. Over the next several weeks, a committee was formed to draft a formal declaration. The committee was led by Thomas Jefferson, a young delegate from Virginia, who would go on to become one of the most important figures in American history. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, a document that proclaimed the colony's separation from Britain and outlined the philosophical justification for the Revolution. In his opening lines, Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This bold declaration was not just a call for freedom from British rule, but a statement of universal rights and the principles of democracy. The American Revolution had become a fight not only for the sovereignty of the colonies, but for the very ideals of liberty and equality. The War for Independence. The war continued for several more years, with the Continental Army and its allies battling the British across a vast territory. The early years were filled with hardship, as Washington's forces were often outmatched and under-resourced. But the colonists had a strong motivation to win. They were fighting for their homes, their rights, and their freedom. In 1777, the Americans achieved a pivotal victory at the Battle of Saratoga, where British General John Burgoyne was forced to surrender his army. This victory proved to be a turning point in the war, as it convinced France to enter the conflict as an ally of the United States. French support, both in terms of military aid and financial resources, was crucial to the success of the Revolution. The war would continue for several more years, with key battles taking place in places like Yorktown in 1781. There, American and French forces surrounded the British army led by General Cornwallis. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, effectively bringing an end to the major fighting in the war. The birth of a nation. With the defeat of the British, the United States of America had won its independence, but the work of building a new nation was just beginning. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing the United States as an independent nation. But the challenges were far from over. The country needed a new government, one that could balance the demands of a growing and diverse nation while ensuring the protection of the individual rights that had been fought for. In 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution of the United States, creating a framework for the new government. The Constitution was a product of compromise and innovation, establishing a system of checks and balances, a separation of powers, and a Bill of Rights that guaranteed the freedoms of speech, religion, and the press, among other rights. The American Revolution, with all its struggles, had led to the birth of a new nation, one founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and the rule of law. It was a revolution that would inspire countless other movements for freedom around the world, and its ideals would continue to shape the course of history for centuries to come. The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was the beginning of a new era in the history of humankind. It was the birth of a nation that would go on to play a central role on the world stage, a nation whose ideals of democracy and individual rights would resonate far beyond its borders. The struggles of the revolutionaries, their sacrifices, and their courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds laid the foundation for the freedoms that would define the United States and inspire future generations to fight for their own liberty.